Okay, guys, so we're going to start with the first set of notes for genetics on this first page, where to begin talking about genetics, we're really going to start by talking about the father of genetics, which is Gregor Mendel. So Gregor Mendel is known as the father of genetics because he really came up with genetics, or the scientific study of heredity, which is how traits are inherited. So he was an Austrian monk, and I just think that's a cool fact because back in the 1800s, 1700s, in order for people to be a scientist or really spend like their life looking at scientific discoveries, their best option was to be a monk. Like if they didn't come from money or they weren't in the aristocracy, then they would become monks because, what are they called? The places where monks live. They were able to provide, a nice place for them to work and study science apart from their other monk duties. They could, pick up a passion project of whatever it was. So really, I just think that's a cool fact considering the time and what he was able to discover in the monastery. I googled it. Where they live is called the monastery. So in the monastery, they were really able to research or do whatever they found interesting. So that's where a lot of our scientists got their beginning, was in the monastery. So Mendel believed that traits were passed down in different patterns. So he didn't think it was so straightforward where like, oh, half of this goes here, half of this goes here, or like this trait you get from your father, whatever. He figured out that there were different patterns, and since it's a pattern, then we can predict what it's going to look like since it's a pattern. In his studies, he worked a lot with Pisum sativum, which are pea plants. He chose pea plants because these plants have several traits, not just one or two traits. They had several traits that completely exhibited one of two, not a combination, of traits, making it really easy to study. So it wasn't like if you mixed a tall plant with a short plant, they wouldn't be a medium-sized plant. If you mix a tall plant with a short plant, they would either be tall or short, depending on the inheritance pattern. So those were kind of the things he was looking at. It wasn't a combination of both of the traits. It was one or the other, kind of how we looked at if you have freckles or if you don't. Those traits that are either this or that. Some of these traits that he looked at was seed shape. So the shape of the pea seeds, they could be round or wrinkled. They wouldn't be like, kind of wrinkly, like they are either round or they're wrinkled. He looked at seed color, yellow or green. He looked at flower color, which was purple or white. So notice how I have or on all of these, because it wasn't like, maybe a little and this one, like it was either or. Where their flowers were was another trait. Plant height was another trait. And pod shape. Oh, and pod color. So all of those different things he was able to cross or breed to figure out how they were inherited, if it was either this trait or that trait. And as we will find out later, I'll talk about it down in the next paragraph. So Another important fact that I like to include on Mendel, it wasn't like he spent some time working on this. This experiment took him 8 years of his life, and he grew over 10,000 pea plants. So it wasn't like just a little quick, easy project. Like, this was his life's work, and he was dedicated to it. So it took him over 8 years and over 10,000 pea plants to test his hypothesis. So now that you know what Mendel was kind of testing, seed shape, seed color, flower position, plant height, pod shape, pod color, because he realized that things are inherited in patterns, and that was what he was testing, I want you to write a hypothesis. You are going to write a hypothesis. So if blah da 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 da, then blah da 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 da. You're going to go ahead and write that hypothesis that fit with his experiments. So moving on down, let's talk about what Mendel found after those 8 years and 10,000 pea plants. So his conclusions, he figured out quite a few things. So the first thing he figured out was that yes, parents transmit information. Wrong thing. To their offspring through what he called factors. He didn't really have a word for it, but he realized like there's something going on here. Parents are passing this down through these factors. Air quotes. Factors. So since parents pass the information to the offspring, that means that the offspring has two factors because you get one from each parent. You get one from the male, one from the female. So each individual has two factors for a trait, one from each parent. And before he really figured out what factors he was talking about, he used letters to easily represent these factors. So since each parent can have either the dominant or the recessive, and then they give one of those to the offspring, there are different combinations of these factors that the offspring could get. So if the genes are different, then they are called heterozygous. The word heter, we know, means different, meaning that they are different genes. So a big A and a little a. We don't represent them with different letters because they're still the same gene, but just different forms of the gene, right? So it's still like for eye color, or not eye color, but for freckles, and it would either be freckles or no freckles, right? So it's still the gene for freckles, just whether or not, or which gene you have for it. And so then if the genes are the same, we call them homozygous. Homo meaning same, as we know. And this could be two big letters or two little letters together. They're the same form of the gene. The dominant gene is known, or we represent it with the big letter, is the dominant gene, and that's the homozygous dominant. So homozygous dominant, we'd call them big A, big A. This one is homozygous dominant. And then if they're both recessive or both have the little letter, then they're homozygous recessive. So you can't ever just say homozygous. You have to specify homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. You can always just say heterozygous because that means both of them. But you can't just say homozygous. You have to say homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive to really talk about which one you're referring to. So since Mendel came up with this idea of factors, we have given it a name. And so these factors are now called alleles. Make sure you are listening to me when I pronounce that word because it's an easy word to mispronounce. But these alleles make up the following. So the alleles can tell us a few things. It can tell us the genotype, which are basically like which alleles the organism has, or the type of genes, aka big A, little a, big A, little a, all the different combinations of the genes that they could have would be their genotype because it's their genes. And then from the alleles, you can also figure out the phenotype. And the phenotype is the way that the trait is expressed physically, aka tall, short, yellow, green. And the way that I remember this, and we'll teach y'all how to remember, is that the phenotype is represented physically. So they both start with a f, phenotype and physically. And phenotypes can kind of be subjective. So if you're talking about tall, short, yellow, green, all those things can be subjective to the viewer.